Hey, hello, hi, welcome back. Do you ever do something, finish a project or whatever, and then whenever you're done with it, you're like, wow, I hated every second of that and that was terrible. And then you usually have the positive, well, at least it's done and it looks nice or it sounds nice or whatever. I recorded this video and I rewatched it and I just hated it. So, I'm gonna we're gonna go informal with this one. I'm not gonna read my script. I'm just gonna look at it for reference points. Um, so yeah, if you are ready for this down and dirty uh, Ottoman Empire tax schemes discussion, buckle in. Okay, so like I said before, I'm going to be talking about some of the tax schemes and attempts to raise revenue that the Ottoman Empire utilized basically throughout the entirety of its existence and how that definitely played a part in its ultimate dissolution in 1922. So some of the things that contributed to the fall of the empire included global and domestic politic, corruption at various levels of their government, but mostly what I'm going to talk about are the series of fluctuating, poorly applied, poorly maintained economic policies and tax schemes that they tried to implement that ultimately consistently underperformed, and it just didn't work. So throughout the history of the Ottoman Empire, the state coffins were intended, like any country, to fund the ruling body and everything from there on down. So for the empire, the coffers were intended to fund, obviously, the Sultanate, as well as provide wages and materiel to pursue their ongoing goal of continuous expansion. That was an underlying consistent thing that the Ottoman Empire was always striving for, was to gain more land, more territory. So their economy was originally, and really through most of its time, primarily agricultural related. And so it's not terribly surprising to learn and to know that a lot of their tax schemes were based on that agricultural economy. Quote, arable Ottoman land was state-owned and divided into tamars, which were these conditional and temporary land grants, essentially, that the government was giving to people who were in the military. Obviously, not everybody who was in the military got the land, so usually it was going to be the upper echelons, to include the Janissaries and the Siafi, which were the cavalrymen. The reason that the Ottoman Empire was particularly into this idea is because they were able to provide this land in lieu of wages. They considered the revenue that was being generated by that land to be their wages, and in fact, the amount of land that was given was calculated based on how much money they would raise, and it would equal the cost of the upkeep of a cavalryman and his horse for a year. And another reason why they particularly liked this was because it incentivized joining and maintaining military service. You had to be in the service for at least 5 to 7 years, and the land grants themselves only lasted about 5 to 7 years, so it was just a continual hey, if you stay in, you can keep this property.
I believe you're forgetting about our 5% military discount.
And it sounds like a great deal on the surface, right? But the reality is that all of the money that was being taken or being generated by these particular plots of land, by the cultivation of said land, would be taxed, which, again, makes sense. It's the whole purpose, right? Except for every single part of the bureaucratic, essentially, system that money would go through would have a little bit skimmed off the top. And so by the time it ultimately reached the state coffers, so much had been removed that it was a pittance. It was nothing. They were not making any money from it.
50. Oh, this is a button.
So this Tamar system lasted throughout basically the first 100 years of the Ottoman Empire's existence, and by the mid-13th century, the Tamar system saw its first major change. Due to their expansion and thus number of potential candidates for these Tamar grants, the Tamars themselves then began to be parceled out into smaller pieces. And instead of having the parcel be essentially like a village, you get to own this whole village, now you get to have this little bit of a village. And so it wasn't super uncommon for the super higher echelons of these military men to get little parcels in multiple villages rather than in just one. And this was a combination of trying to make sure that there wasn't too much power in one given area, and also not wanting to upset these people who had recently, had a very stable, at least for them, lifestyle.
Thank you for coming. Thank you. Oh, get out of here.
So as the military continued to advance in their technology, namely the adoption of guns as their primary weapon of choice, the Siafi, as a regiment essentially, started to go away. And as they went away, the government had to reassess how they were going to determine who was going to be eligible for the Tamar parcels of land. By the end of the 16th century, the lands that were once held by the Siafi were no longer being reassigned, but were instead being incorporated back into the imperial domain. And that was to try and ensure better cash revenue. They were trying to get around the whole skimming off the top that had been plaguing them for a hot minute at that point, except that it didn't work out how they were hoping. The end of the Siafi and Tamar system period ushered in this new era of the tax farmer. So historian Ariel Salzman called tax farming, quote, the uncelebrated forerunner of contemporary civilization, end quote. Tax farming was basically introduced to, again, reconsolidate state control and also provide the necessary finances to maintain a stronger infantry. So rather than having the land being granted directly by the government, they were instead auctioned at, quote, specific times and places for the right to collect the taxes of a district with arable land, end quote. Through surveys, the government determined what the land's value, and this value is what determined, obviously, the price that they were going to be auctioning it off at, which the winner would have to pay in cash upon securing said tax farm. But in return, whoever owned the tax farm got to collect the revenues from the land. So not unlike the Tamar system, though, the tax farmer would only be one level of collection on the ladder of tax money movement. One characteristic that set the tax farm apart from the Tamars was the recognition of the employment of financiers who can then take a cut of revenue themselves. So they essentially made that, at least that initial tax skimming, legal. But it added an extra level of complexity that, of course, meant it was easier to exploit at other levels as well.
Because the house always wins. Play long enough, you never change the stakes, the house takes you.
An unfortunate part of the tax farm system, and really of the Tamar system, is that tax farming added to the burden of a peasant's annual output. So they had tithes and animal taxes, which were due directly to the government, and then local administrators and provincial governors augmented their incomes with additional local taxes. Between these constant requirements from the peasantry, the average Ottoman civilian was excessively poor, and they were kept in essentially a state of perpetual debt.
Hide the money, y'all! There's poor people around!
But the peasantry were not the only ones who were in this state of perpetual debt. A lot of tax farmers themselves were also caught in this debt cycle. Interestingly, the tax farmers were often, quote, indebted to a number of private financiers who guaranteed tax farming contracts, end quote. So as a result, the tax farms were not being cultivated with state interests in mind, but were instead being cultivated and managed with the financiers' interests in mind, which generally did not include thinking about the state getting money at all. Tax collection abuse was rampant by the end of the 16th century, which resulted, unsurprisingly, in weak public finances. Unfortunately, this led to a widespread fear of confiscation of property and the degradation of the vakf, WAQF, which was a dedicated Muslim social structure within the empire, or were multiple, it was more than just one Waqf. There were Waqfs aplenty. The Waqf itself was not taxable, which drew the attention of the upper class, which unfortunately transformed the community forward. Government endowed lands from a social benefit to a tax haven for the upper cut. Does that sound familiar to anyone else?
Something very familiar about all this.
Unfortunately, the state of the empire's control did not really improve throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. There were a series of these tax cuts which were made to appease the higher level members of the government and to entice newly conquered people to accept their new leaders, because again, they were still all about expansion. Unfortunately, between the tax cuts, the currency being consistently and continuously debased, and like a really, really slow rate of improvement in technology, both socially and militarily, it resulted in an ever-weakening state, not just weak state coffer. Revenues remained low, and it's not just because of the inability to collect taxes, but because of the rampant abuse by the urban elites within the provinces. Basically, what the elite would end up doing is they would utilize their military forces and their local networks to disrupt the government's ability to raise additional revenue. One thing I sort of forgot to mention is that the basically all of these land-based grants expected the current title owner, holder, whatever you want to call them, to not only produce agricultural based revenue, but also to train and maintain essentially local militia to be utilized if the government needed them. Unfortunately, that also meant that these people tended to have little armies loyal to them. By the end of the 17th century, extreme financial instability was a really big deal. Quote, war against the Habsburgs and their allies in the Holy League 1683 to 89 provoked decisive changes to the balance of power within the Ottoman state and the fiscal regime itself, end quote. These notables were wealthy, and as they proved throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, if they didn't like what you were doing with their money, they would just dethrone you. Unfortunately for the Sultanate, they had no power, really. So over time, the tax farm system evolved. They moved from being these little pre-portioned set time grants, usually for 5 to 7 years, into these life term ones, otherwise known as Malikane Mukata. Editor, how is this said?
Malikane Mukata.
Thanks. So upon being awarded these
Malikane Mukata,
the tax farm were paid 3 times the assumed profit, and gave the contractor rights to collect taxes at a set established rate, which was set at the time of the award of said
Malikane Mukata.
However, there's always a however, private interest and government interest continued to be at odds. Any reorganization or reallocation of Ottoman finances were de-incentivized, essentially, by private central state investors, to include any attempt to establish officialdom for the future of Melicanization. Unfortunately, this whole still being based off of the land system wasn't going to work out super well for them. By the 17th century, they saw a rapid decline in cultivation. The peasants were neglected and impoverished and, quote, were forced into the hands of moneylenders and speculators and often driven off the land entirely, end quote. So by this time, the Ottoman Empire is continuing to have trouble making ends meet, and demands on the treasury are becoming alarmingly high. Mostly thanks to a bloated core of state salaried personnel who were loath to lose their status and income, and thus were resistant to any kind of change. And like we said before, if they didn't like your changes, they'd just oust ya. That, combined with involvement in various wars throughout the 17th, 18th century, most notably in the 18th century with the Napoleonic Wars, they were broke.
With your broke ass.
Also, in the 18th century, domestic trade vastly outweighed international trade, and this isn't necessarily a detriment to the overall empire's economic state, but it really didn't allow for any additional growth, as was being seen in their European counterparts. What little export the Ottomans had was aggravated by all of these wars and cut them off from really important income sources. That, plus the consistent debasement of the Ottoman currency, making it really kind of worthless, culminated in a weak economy. And so while the import-export trade is not necessarily an end-all be-all of a country's economic health, it is a diagnostic tool when discussing overall potential for growth, which is necessary when the population growth shows no signs of slowing and you need foreign investment to help bolster you. If you don't look like you're going to be able to return on that investment, they're not going to invest in you. And it really didn't help that the empire's industrialization was slow at best, completely stagnant at worst. Quote, a man's choice of profession was determined by habit and inheritance, the scope of his endeavor limited by primitive techniques and transport, his manner and speed of work fixed by guild rules and tradition. On the one hand, a Sufi religious habit of passivity and surrender of self, on the other, the swift fiscal retribution for any sign of prosperity, combined to keep industrial production primitive, static, and inert, utterly unable to resist the competition of imported European manufactures, end quote. This slow movement towards industrialization had lasting impacts on the economy throughout the remainder of the Ottoman Empire's existence, which wasn't that much longer.
If you're just joining us, we are continuing our coverage of the ominous music that is sending panic across the nation.
By the end of the 18th century, the Mullikhani contracts were beginning to be phased out, and the government needed to reassess their primary source of income, not like it was a particularly good one to begin with. So throughout the late 18th century and into the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced humiliating defeats in various wars. They lost huge swaths of land, to include Crimea, a large part of the Yeresan region, Egypt, Bessarabia, Serbia, Greece, Wallachia, Moldavia, Georgia, and large parts of present-day Armenia, and that is not an exhaustive list. The empire's agriculturally based economy was in absolute shambles, and by still relying on tax farms and their predecessors as primary sources of income, the lack of land now to cultivate and thus generate revenue from was so very small. Laughably small. And to further aggravate their depleting treasury, quote, by the end of the Tanzimat period, 1876 to 1909, the Ottoman Empire was a government without teeth, end quote. Several accounts of revenue estimates place taxes collected and revenue generated that actually reached the state somewhere between 15% and 5%. Yeah. Despite the abolition of the Janissaries and significant re-centralization in the Ottoman Empire's economic policies in the last century of the empire, which did increase their revenue by 15-fold of what it had been previously, the move was made way too late. By the time World War I had rolled around, a major economic and military drain on the empire, they were never able to recover.
And that's it.
World War I was devastating to the Ottoman Empire. It's ultimately what resulted in their dissolution. Despite the Sultan's desire to remain neutral, he was essentially bullied into agreeing to work with one of their more consistent partner nations, which was Germany, so that made them a part of the Central Powers. They were indebted to so many other European countries. What the government was hoping was that if they won and they decimated the other countries, then all of their debts would be erased, but we all know exactly how that one worked out. When the Central Powers lost, what ended up happening to the Ottoman Empire was they were basically just carved up into little pieces, and they lost pretty much all of what they had. Within 4 years of the Treaty of Sèvres, the empire officially dissolved, and what we all know today as Turkey came to be in 1924. Over the 600 years of its existence, the Ottoman Empire continuously faced so many problems. I didn't talk about the global and domestic politic, and I didn't really get super into the corruption at all of the different levels of government, but their tax schemes, man, they just did not work. They never quite figured that one out. And unfortunately, because they were unable to maintain even footing, any kind of concept of stability, they were completely unable to defend themselves, to maintain a place on the world stage, and ultimately got dissolved. Thank you guys for joining me in this video. I really enjoyed putting it together. I hope you enjoyed watching it. If you like this kind of video, please consider subscribing. I like to upload every 3 weeks. If you like this particular subject, maybe leave a comment. Let me know what else you'd like to learn about. Actually, in fact, if you want to learn about anything, just leave me a little comment, a little comedy poo. Let me know what you're into. I am so glad that you decided to join me, and I hope I will see you all in the next one. Bye! Quote, war against the hamburgers.